Hello, welcome to Global South World. We are live. I am Duncan Hooper. This is Joe Houghton, and we are bringing some breaking news around the situation in Venezuela, where Donald Trump has just announced that US forces have captured the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, and removed him from the country. This follows months of US pressure on Venezuela. It comes after a number of strikes, first of all, over the past months on Venezuelan boats, which the Americans said were carrying narcotics. But this morning, dramatically, the very early hours of the morning in Venezuela, there were strikes in the capital, Caracas, and also in some other regions believed to have been targeting military facilities. It was unclear exactly what had happened. Then reports started to emerge that the US was behind this and that Donald Trump had ordered the attacks. The Colombian president Gustavo Petro came out and said he believed that the US had attacked Venezuela. He called for a UN Security Council meeting. Then the Venezuelan government themselves said that there'd been an attack, described it as an imperialist act of aggression, said that the US was trying to get hold of Venezuelan natural resources, including oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And they mobilized the country. They said that they declared a state of emergency. They said that they needed their people to stand up against this imperialist aggression. And then dramatically, in the last few minutes, Donald Trump on Truth Social has come out and said that he has ordered this strike. The strike was part of a law enforcement operation, and really extraordinarily said that he has effectively kidnapped the president of Venezuela and taken him into US custody. Trump, of course, has accused the Venezuelan president of being the leader of a drug cartel. He says that he is responsible for running this cartel, for shipping drugs, which have been killing thousands and thousands of Americans. That's quite a controversial claim because many people would say that the deaths in America, in fact, the deaths in America primarily are caused by fentanyl. The Venezuelans have argued this fentanyl is something that was initially introduced to the market by drug companies, particularly Purdue Pharma. So they've said, look, if you want to sort out your drug problem, look to yourselves. This isn't ours. Venezuela is a producer alongside its neighbor Colombia, which is the biggest in the world, of cocaine. So there is indeed a large amount of drug activity, illegal drug activity, which does emanate from there, although a lot of people would argue that the issues that America faces are more to do with drugs coming in from Mexico, in fact, than coming directly from Venezuela. So, Joe, I know you've been following this story. I know you've spoken to one of your former colleagues in recent weeks for us for Global South World about what's going on. Can you give us a bit of the background? So before today, what was the situation? Why is the US so exercised about the situation in Venezuela?
Well, there has been sort of claims that Donald Trump has made claims that Venezuela is a sort of a narco state. As you said, he's called Maduro a drug dealer, head of a drug cartel. But then the US has been quite open, on the other hand, about their interest in Venezuelan oil. And
Yeah,
Venezuela,
and particularly, I mean, they pitched this as a law enforcement organization, but that's been very controversial, even in America, hasn't it? And Congress has been saying, that they are not happy about these strikes on boats because essentially boats have been blown out of the water by the US military without really any evidence that they were carrying drugs, apparently on intelligence justifications, but without any kind of judicial process, people are being killed. And that's been very controversial, hasn't it? Even in America.
yeah, the videos we've seen have really called into question some of the Geneva Conventions and regulations around war. We've seen footage of people getting striked, and it has seemed definitely excessive. We've seen double taps on ships where there'll be two strikes when clearly that boat has been taken out of use with the first one. But again, Trump has been justifying it by saying that he's cracking down on the drug trade in the Caribbean Sea, and it's always from a place of protecting Americans, and he'll use that narrative, never an aggressive aggression against Venezuela. It will always be protecting Americans, and as you say, trying to prevent that drug trade that he claims is causing such a problem, which is causing a major problem, but it is only tells half the story, as you say,
Yeah, I mean, the
with
extent to
fentanyl.
which Venezuela
Uh,
is responsible for America's drug problem is I think, quite controversial. We can quickly, I think we can see some imagery from the streets of Venezuela this morning. So this is what it looks like on the streets in the aftermath of those US strikes. Now, it seems those US strikes were targeting military facilities. That is what the reports on the ground, what witnesses said, particularly there's an airfield in Caracas which was said to have been hit. The US reports coming from the US also said that Donald Trump had ordered a strike on military facilities. But it seems much more than just airstrikes now. It seems as though US forces have somehow gone into Venezuela. They have somehow managed to capture Maduro, which is quite an extraordinary feat, as he would obviously have been, closely guarded. And they have taken him out of the country, according to Donald Trump, along with his wife. Now, this has been, a goal of US policy really since Maduro's been in power. His position was contested. There were elections in Venezuela, which he claimed to have won, but many observers said were rigged. There were elections where, the opposition seemed to have won, and then the results were overturned. And we saw just recently the Nobel Peace Prize went to a member of the Venezuelan opposition. So the leadership in that country has been under a lot of pressure. Which makes it even more surprising that the US was able to go into the country and extract Nicolas Maduro, which, indeed, we only have Donald Trump's word that this has happened, but he has said this publicly on his Truth Social accounts, and he believes that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is now in American custody. It'd be very interesting to see what possible outcomes there can be of that. I mean, will there be a trial? As I say, Donald Trump says that Nicolas Maduro is the head of the Cartel of the Suns, which is a notorious drug cartel. So he would suggest that Maduro has been guilty of offences, but could they have a trial? Because the idea of kidnapping someone from foreign territory is obviously going to be immensely controversial. A number of countries, actually, including the UK, where I am, have stopped intelligence sharing around Latin America with the US, according to media reports, because they are concerned about whether the US actions have been legal, particularly attacking those boats. So there will be, obviously a massive amount of interest in what happens next in this process. Donald Trump, I think, said he will hold a press conference. That's right, 11 a.m. He said, Joe.
Yeah, that's right, 11 a.m.
So it remains to see what happens next. But Joe, perhaps you can just resume where we are this morning for those who are joining us now.
Yeah, so the latest is that Trump has announced on a Truth Social post that President Maduro and his wife have been taken out the country, and that the US has successfully carried out a large scale strike against Venezuela. This is including military bases, but also the capital of Caracas. And this has been following ramping tensions between America and Venezuela, with Trump claiming that Maduro is the head of a drug cartel. But there's talk, especially from the lines out of Venezuela, that this is much more to do with oil and Venezuela's rich oil reserves, and almost like a colonial move. Trump again would argue that this is protecting American citizens and trying to combat the flow of drugs coming out of Venezuela. I think what's quite interesting is how this is going to affect the balance of power across the world and whether or not Trump can justify this with his allies in Europe and also, the powerful countries in South America. I know that President Lula of Brazil and Petro of Colombia have been quite outspoken about Trump's aggression in Venezuela, warning him against making any sort of further moves, the land operations that he's been promising. Lula has said that it will lead to a humanitarian crisis. I've even heard the phrase a sort of a Vietnam style regional conflict. So there's definitely been tension, especially as Europe and Latin America are looking to make their own trades. So this is another example. This might be one of the biggest cases of that unilateral world order being disrupted and people in Europe and elsewhere really getting quite worried about what America will do next. And as you said,
Yeah, Joe, just to break in there. I mean, what's fascinating is that this, the US has been putting this pressure on Maduro for a long time. And actually, the two leaders, Maduro and Trump, they did hold a phone call. Media reports of that phone call suggested that Maduro had actually agreed that he would step down. He wanted a large sum of cash, which was reported not to be a problem for the US to give him that money. But he was also demanding that he'd be able to remain in the region, potentially going to Cuba, something like that. And that was reported as the stumbling block that Donald Trump was not willing to agree to. He wanted him to leave, perhaps go to Russia, perhaps go to the Middle East, somewhere far away where he wouldn't be able to influence events as much, and he'd be able to sort of keep a low profile, I guess is the feeling. But it's quite extraordinary that given that offer, which would have achieved, you would have thought Donald Trump's objective in removing Maduro was turned down, and instead he's resorted to this intensely controversial, intensely risky strategy of actually sending people. It would seem, we don't know whether the US has actually sent people into Venezuela or whether elements within Venezuela have delivered Maduro up to US forces somewhere else. That's not clear. There is a strong opposition movement in Venezuela. It has seemed that the army has been very supportive of Maduro. I think actually, let's take a look. We've got some footage. Venezuela currently in a state of emergency. The government has ordered all elements of society to mobilize, but it's not clear what exactly that will mean without the president. And it's also not clear, if the president has been, let's say, betrayed by his own bodyguard, by his own military, and taken to the US, that will change the situation too. What plan is there in there for a new government? Does the US have a plan? Is the Venezuelan opposition in a position? Does it have enough strength to come to power? Could there even be some kind of civil war which happens now? Because we do know that this government, this left-wing government, has been in power in Venezuela for decades. Hugo Chavez was the leader before Maduro, with his very kind of firebrand revolutionary rhetoric. And there are a lot of people in the country who will be sympathetic to this. And a lot of people with a lot to lose. So we don't know what is going to happen next. And I know that we will be watching it all day and through the coming days on globalsouthworld.com, also on our social media, so at Global South World, on Instagram if you're watching us there now, on TikTok, on Facebook. And Joe, so I know when you spoke recently to your colleague in in Colombia, and you were talking about these drug strikes, weren't you? And you mentioned earlier this double tap. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and why that's been controversial? You're on mute, I think, Joe.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a video doing the rounds um, on social media of one of these boats. Some claim it was a fishing vessel, others said that they were smuggling drugs out of the country, and that was in the Caribbean. And this particular one caused controversy because you could see very clearly actually that the people on the boat, once there was one strike from America, hit the boat pretty directly. It sank, pretty much sank the boat. In that first strike, you could see the people trying to swim, trying to stay afloat, grab hold of debris. And then what was controversial was that there was a second strike. Um, and after that second strike, we couldn't see anybody in the water anymore. So that obviously calls into question any claims of this being a case of trying to stop the drugs coming out of the country and protecting US citizens, when you have to ask, what was that second strike, that double tap?
Mm.
What was that for? It seemed almost well, definitely excessive. Um, and that's been called into question.
What we saw was Congress trying to hold the president to account for this, and urging inquiries and investigations. And Donald Trump, really seemed to stand by Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, and basically was able to, resist this pressure because this campaign has been going on for months and months and months. There's been a lot of criticism from around the world, from Latin America. You pointed out President Lula in Brazil, President Petro in Colombia. Lots of unease around the world, countries like the UK saying they wouldn't share intelligence because they're worried about the legality of this, concerns expressed within the United Nations. But Donald Trump typically has just brushed this off and continued and really, escalated things to a huge degree here because, yes, on the one hand, the US had been intercepting oil tankers. It had been attacking boats in the waters around Venezuela. It had actually struck the Venezuelan mainland as well, so it hit a dock which was being used to load drugs. But this idea of attacking the capital Caracas, and particularly this idea of taking a country's leader out of the country. I mean, I'm trying to think of a time that's happened in the past, and I'm really struggling to think of a head of state essentially being kidnapped or forcibly removed from his own country by another power. Obviously, we have seen regime change, but that's largely been done deliberately on the soil of the countries affected. We saw Saddam Hussein tried in Iraq by Iraqis, albeit with American involvement. And we've seen obviously America's had disasters like this. We remember the Bay of Pigs, where they tried to overturn Fidel Castro's rule in Cuba, and it was an absolute disaster and embarrassment for the country. So it was a very, very bold call, I think, if Donald Trump has, ordered the U.S. military to do this, because had it gone wrong, it would have been intensely awkward for him. And now it's gone right. He's brought himself also a number of questions and a number of problems to answer because the UN certainly going to have something to say on this. Other Latin American countries certainly will be very, I would have thought, concerned about it. What kind of precedent does this set? What does it mean for the situation in Iran, of course, as well? Because we have protests in Iran. Donald Trump has said he's ready to go into Iran. He's ready to try and overthrow the leadership there. I mean, could we really see the US involved in these two countries? Because Donald Trump has made such a big thing about extricating US forces from conflicts abroad. And now he seems to be directly involving himself in one and possibly two. Um, So again, Joe, perhaps could you just resume what we know so far? You saw Donald Trump's statement on Truth Social, which is the first time that we had some confirmation of what's happened with Nicolas Maduro. What did he say exactly?
Yeah, so he was announcing, he started by announcing that the United States has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. Um, he also went on to say that the operation was done in conjunction with US law enforcement, and that there'll be a news conference today, 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago, which I think will be 4 p.m. here in the UK.
So no mention
It's
of any cooperation from the Venezuelan side there. I mean, he
no,
specifically said it was in conjunction with US law enforcement. So no suggestion there that actually this is Venezuelan forces turning against their own president.
no, exactly. There's no mention of that, but of course that may still be the case. It's interesting that he says law enforcement. Again, that's sort of still uh, going along the lines of this being a crackdown on drug trade, and the narrative that Maduro is the leader of a drug cartel, which of course Venezuela would deny, and they are sort of framing this much more as open aggression, and uh, an attempt to go for Venezuela's oil supply.
Yeah, at a time, when Maduro himself had expressed some willingness to compromise. Last week he did an interview, State TV. He said, we are open to US investment. We are ready to be constructive with the US. We are ready to engage with them. We want to talk. And it seems that America did not want to talk, and indeed really wanted to do the opposite and take some action. But what possible jurisdiction America has over Venezuela, what possible rights it will be able to claim if it wants to put Maduro on trial is difficult to see. Because clearly Venezuela is a sovereign nation. Whatever happens in Venezuela is for Venezuela or international law enforcement, the ICC, which of course the US does not recognize, to rule on. So if the US is going to say, look, we have jurisdiction to try anyone in the world, on terrorism cases. In the past, there has been an argument which has been made for this. The killing of Osama bin Laden on Pakistani soil obviously was justified as removing a threat to the US. Although obviously there was no formal trial of Osama bin Laden. But in terrorism cases, that has been justified. And it's actually the terrorism legislation and essentially the laws of war that Donald Trump has invoked when he's been blowing these narcotics boats or these alleged narcotics boats out of the water, because he said essentially they pose a threat to the US, and therefore he's not said, look, this is an operation against criminals. He said this is an operation against terrorists. He's declared these cartels as terrorists, and therefore, I guess his argument will be that Nicolas Maduro is a terrorist, and therefore the US is in its rights to remove that threat to itself. But we'll have to see, how that plays out, and what will happen to Nicolas Maduro, because there will be, I imagine, intense pressure from around the world, from many, many countries. Both those on the more democratic side who will be saying, look, this isn't rule of law, and those on the more authoritarian side who will be perhaps worried about the precedent that it can set for themselves. So, yep, this is clearly a massive, massive story. I mean, we've started the new year with a huge, huge news development here. This is the biggest story, certainly the of the last year for sure. And it's again Donald Trump, as we imagined, surprising the world, doing something a little bit unexpected. Joe, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to all the people who have joined us online. Globalsouthworld.com is the way to keep up with this story, and our social media channels at Global South World, where you're watching this, or pretty much anywhere else you can find social content. So we will keep you up to date. Just to resume before we go, Donald Trump has announced on Truth Social that he has captured the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, that he has removed him from the country. He said this was done in conjunction with US law enforcement officials. There have been strikes in Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, and a number of provinces which are believed to have hit military facilities. We don't know how President Maduro was removed from the country. We don't know what element of involvement of Venezuelan military there has been in that. We do know that Venezuela has declared a state of emergency and called on its people to rise up against imperialist aggression and an attack. We know there have been calls from Venezuela's neighbors for a UN Security Council meeting to address this. And Donald Trump is going to be giving us more information in a press conference at 11 a.m. US time. So thank you for joining us, Joe. Thank you, everybody. And we will be with you throughout the day.